I begin by testing out all my different etching tools. Different tools make different marks and would be better for different textures, but also different tools work better on different paper. And I determined that my metal etching tool is what worked best on this practice paper. If you're not mature enough to handle it though, you might have to use a toothpick or a wooden skewer. I then divide my paper in half. You don't have to use a ruler, but I had one close by. And I label one side of my practice paper ostrich and the other side of my practice paper value scales. I then go down and I label each area for each different value scale I'm going to do. Hatching, cross hatching, stippling, and finally scumbling, which we all know is just intentional scribbling. And if you want to pause the video here and give you a chance to get caught up to this point, you can. If you didn't remember, a value scale measures the difference between light and dark. So one side of your value scale should be darker because you scratch off less, and then the other side of your value scale should be lighter because you scratch off more, and it should be somewhat blended in between. Hatching is a technique which uses lines going in the same direction. So I began by scratching a nice even layer all the way across, keeping my lines individual, not one scribbled line, and keeping them spaced apart. And then I worked up to my brighter values or my lighter values by scratching more off on one side. Cross-hatching starts out the same way. You start by just hatching individual lines, again, not one scribbled line, and you keep them spaced apart for the line of that's going to be your value scale, and then you crisscross lines to create the cross-hatching technique. Keep it all nice and even. All your gray tones would be spaced apart, whereas your darker tones would be not scratched off at all, and then your lighter tones would be scratched off more. Just like you can see here, I've worked up to my lighter area by scratching off more on the right-hand side. And I try to blend it out so it doesn't go from just dark to light. It needs to be a real gradual progression because that's a more accurate value scale. It's important to remember that each of these techniques is going to be perfect for creating a different type of texture for your final project. Hatching might work really well for different types of animal fur, whereas stippling might work really well for a dog's nose. And if you didn't remember, stippling is using dots to create value. So I begin by spacing out my dots. This would create my gray values, not my really dark values, not my really light ones, just my mid-tones. And so I space my dots out for my value scale, and then I begin scratching more dots off on the right-hand side to create my lighter, or in this case, my brighter values, because we are revealing a bright color underneath. Then I even switch my etching tool around to scratch some larger dots to help me move a little bit quicker with this value scale. But then I switch back over to my metal smaller etching tool so that I can help blend the dark side and the light side together. Finally, scumbling, or what I like to call intentional scribbling, are just using loose etching marks in your own style. It's important to keep them really loose so it's easier to blend out. So I just have almost like C-shaped, the letter C-shaped marks repeated over and over again. And then I begin to build up to my brighter values by scratching more off and layering more marks right there so that it reveals the color underneath. But a lot of kids like to use really tight circular marks, but that would be really hard to blend out. So it's important to just study each technique and figure out what will work best for the texture you're trying to create for your final project, which will mean you studying your realistic photo and your scratch art reference.